Hello, welcome everyone. Hello, welcome everyone. We'll just wait till more people are joining us. I'll just wait till everyone's come in. Okay. Okay, we might get started. So hello everyone and welcome to today's session. I'm Rhiannon Brodie and the Chairperson of Foundations Forum. This is the first session of 3 webinars that we'll be hosting with accredited teacher of SRV John Armstrong. Before we begin, I'd first of all like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, wherever that may be for you. For me, here in Sydney, it is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It is upon their ancestral lands that we're all present as we share our own knowledge, teaching, learning and experiences. May we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. So welcome wherever you have joined us today, whether it is your first time to a Foundations Forum event or you're a regular attendee and or a member. I'm also joined today by our new project coordinator, Rosita Suna, who has been the key driver of organising and planning for these webinars.
Hello and welcome everyone. I trust that John's information will be of value to you and I'm excited that you are part of today's session. If you enjoyed our webinar, please share Foundations Forum's event via your social channels and your networks. We love to hear from you. Please email us or give us a call. Cheers and back to Rihanna.
Before we start this session, just a bit of information about us. Foundations Forum is a New South Wales non-profit volunteer organisation formed in 1985 by a group of individuals committed to improving the lives of people who are marginalised in society. Our aim is to challenge, inspire and encourage individuals and organisations to pursue better lives for people who are at risk of being devalued by promoting the principles and practice of social role valorisation. We aim to assist people to understand social devaluation and disadvantage in our community, especially as it affects the lives of people who are marginalised. Our emphasis is on organising and conducting workshops and training events designed to create a deeper awareness of the circumstances of people who are devalued by society, as well as offering positive strategies for creating the conditions which are more likely to lead to a better life for those people. Due to the COVID-19 this year, we have not been able to host any face-to-face workshops. We know that this has left many of you disappointed, but inspired by the high demand for our workshops, we've worked really hard to be able to offer you for the first time these webinars. We are pleased to let you know that John, who is presenting the webinars, will also be coming back in February to deliver our face-to-face workshops in Sydney. John will share more about these workshops at the end of today's webinar. We're keen to connect with you and look forward to keeping in touch with you via regular updates and upcoming workshops and events. A recorded version of this webinar will be available and we will be emailing you the link with some additional resources and links to our website. We have 2 polls at the beginning and end of the webinar and a short survey, which will be available at the end. We appreciate your input and your feedback is really important. Our survey is anonymous and your answers will help support us in our future work and enhance the way we provide our events. During the session today, you have the opportunity to ask questions by typing into the question and answer box located at the bottom menu bar towards the end of the session, and John will attempt to answer as many of your questions. So now I would like to introduce John Armstrong, a longtime friend and supporter of Foundations Forum. John has had a long career in many human service roles, the last 30 as a human service consultant, evaluator and trainer to people, family and organisations across Australia, New Zealand and other parts of the world. His work is underpinned by the knowledge and application of social role valorisation. So as John just comes on, we'll just put up our first poll to begin with. And you just need to be able to click yes or no. The first poll today, are you aware of the distinction between programmatic issues and non-programmatic issues and their implications for effective service? So if people just want to click yes or no, we'll give and over to you, John. All right, we might just stop the video, stop the poll and share those results. Yep, so yes, 40% of you have said they are aware, and we've got 53% that aren't. So over to you, John.
Okay, John.
Oh, there I am. Thank you. That's great. Hi, everyone. Sorry for that little mix up with how to unmute ourselves the other end. Great to see you here today. We're looking today at getting lost in some of the organisational arrangements that occur, and it can be overwhelming no matter what system you're in. So today isn't so much a critique of the NDIS or those arrangements, but of systems of support in general that can sometimes take a priority over the people that we're trying to support. So that's essentially our topic today. I'll take about half an hour on this, and then we'll field some questions for you, and we should be finished around 2 o'clock if all goes well. So great to see you on today. Let's start with the idea of what a service is. We might define a service as one or more people doing something beneficial for one or more people. So a big question here then is, how do you decide what's beneficial? Quite often when a child is born within a family, there are assessments, there's aspects of eligibility, there's applications for funding, early intervention programs that try to intervene in areas that are of concern. And quite often a family can be drawn into the organizational aspects of the service and sometimes leave behind the question of what is it that our son and daughter needs and what is the best way of meeting those needs. So we want to see then a framework that might be useful for us to consider in terms of dealing with the tension between those two questions. What does the person need and what does it take to meet those needs, and how should that be organized? In regard to this then, just down to here, we might consider what we define as programmatic issues. And here it's the sense of our understanding of what it is that a person needs and what would it take to meet those needs. Of course, if we don't know the person very well, then it's easy for us to distort our efforts to respond to them because we haven't in the first place understood the major needs that the person has and given priority to those kind of things. So if, for instance, our perception of the person is distorted, then what we end up giving them will also be distorted. Now, we have other events that examine this dilemma because it's actually a fairly hard work to understand what someone else needs, and especially in those events where people can't necessarily express those things or provide an indication to you, where through your own careful observation, your knowledge of the person and who they are, their very identity, and not just various issues like disabilities, impairments and the like, and the impact those things might have on them, but also the sense of priority in some of that as well, which needs are most urgent over others that might be met later on. Now, of course, in the course of things, as we respond, especially with a formal service, we find ourselves also having to do lots of things that aren't defined by the needs of the person, but are defined by the needs of other parties. And these we call the non-programmatic issues. So here the programmatic issues are central to the nature of our service. Who is this person? What do they need? What would it take to meet those needs? Then the non-programmatic issues that kind of surround this arrangement is everything else, and everything else that's not related to what it is that a person needs. And this is a large area, of course, in this day and age with formal services. You've got aspects of funding, the requirements within the funding. You've got policies, you've got procedures, you've got the presence of unions and the issues for staff and their particular needs, occupational health and safety requirements. You've got tax arrangements, superannuation, you've got all sorts of things that now, in a sense, begin to impact itself on the ability of meeting this person's needs, or this party, which might be one or more people. Now, ideally, the non-programmatic issues help to facilitate your ability to do this. So that's a great thing, that by having some money, you can now take measures that are responsive to the needs of the person. But we often get confused between the measure that we're taking and the need the person has in the first place. We can get confused between those two pieces and confuse the idea that a therapist is the same as a need in that way. That is, the means for meeting the person's needs is the same as the outcome that you're hoping for. And we'll come back to that kind of issue. We also see, though, that quite often in giving and providing these non-programmatic responses, that it also comes with certain constraints. It, for instance, might limit what you're allowed to do as well. It might have something to say about the hours of work or the length of the day or when that support takes place. It might say policies don't permit that. It might even say who's eligible and who isn't eligible, even though the needs of various eligible and ineligible parties might be identical. And so we see this in a lot of the forums that are available online these days of people who've entered the non-programmatic domain and it hasn't gone very smoothly for them. They're saying we need this, but all we're able to get is this, and it doesn't kind of fit. And that's because of the constraint, you might say, that's inherent in the non-programmatic system. And so that's a kind of drawback. In fact, the non-programmatic domain can even distort, so to speak, your ability to meet people's needs, because they might define the needs they're there to meet already. Interesting discussions occurring at the moment as a result of COVID, with result to the needs of people who are having various mental health issues arising. And there's talk almost every second day. You'll hear the need for more money to be put into mental health services, but no one quite knows what mental health services actually deliver, other than perhaps a hotline number or something like that. But more millions are needed. And we might say, well, who qualifies for this? So what is a mental health issue anyway? Is it the anxiety we feel? And is it the isolation that we've experienced? And suicidal ideation that we have? All these kind of things. And you find then that the system here decides then who is in and who is out in certain respects, rather than, and the thing is, if you want part of this system, you might have to also receive that recognition that you are a client as opposed to someone who is ineligible to be a client. And systems, by their very nature, have to draw the line somewhere, I suppose, as to who is a recipient of the service that's being planned for them and who isn't. And so there are often boundaries around those kind of things. But the mental health system, of course, now the boundary is much wider than it used to be. And so we see then that we might facilitate, it might get constrained, but it also might be distorted. There might be things you're not allowed to do as a result of one's acceptance of non-programmatic resources that come from this side of the system. We also might encounter non-programmatic issues that arise out of the history of a service. We've always done it this way and we don't like doing it that way kind of idea. And therefore getting non-programmatic functions to shift ground, for instance, can be hard work. For instance, not to assume that everybody should live in a group home, or everybody should go to a sheltered workshop, or that open employment isn't possible for people. So sometimes there are systemic advocacy issues that have to be fought here that affects many, many people because of the constraint the non-programmatic issues have provided to all sorts of people that might have benefited from a response, but there's an unwillingness on the part of the system to provide that. It's not always a cost factor either. It's more to do, it's the way we do things. It's the way we've always done things for a very long time. And getting that to shift is hard work. So we have the tension between these two things, the issues about who is this person and what would it take to meet their needs, and then all of these programmatic, non-programmatic issues, that then impact itself whenever we set out to do something that utilizes resources from that particular formal domain. So we want to examine some of the impacts of this and then examine some of the things we might do about it to soften or deal with the tension. It's not so much that we can eradicate this so much, but can we live with the tension, and what kind of ideas might we have that bring some clarity? The first idea that brings clarity, though, is to know about these two distinctions. It's a huge advantage to be able to walk into a meeting and to be able to perceive where the meeting starts to talk about non-programmatic issues as though they were programmatic. You know, you might hear people say, well, she needs home help. And you realize home help isn't a human need. It's a response of the non-programmatic domain to a human need. But what is the need? Well, no one discusses that. It's just she needs home help because that's what we've got available. And so that's what comes up in the discussion. Your awareness, whether you're an advocate, whether you're a parent, whether you're a manager, that kind of distinction. But hang on, what is it she really needs here? And if we consider what she really needs here, we might be able to work out all sorts of ways of responding to that need that might not even require home help in the end. So you see that the nice advantage here, understanding and using this. It doesn't mean you have to teach this necessarily in your meetings, but listening for what's being spoken about and knowing where that belongs. It's a regular pattern for people within the service system to assume almost everything they do is a programmatic issue, like they're meeting people's needs, when much of what happens within systems is to meet the needs of the system. The reporting requirements, the so-called accountability, these kind of ideas come from because they're system demands and requirements that have almost no impact on the person being served at all. But people think it does. And so there's much confusion here. So the next one is to realize then that in order to get a support arrangement as good as it might be, it's a huge advantage to start with the programmatic questions first. Unfortunately, families aren't always well supported when children are very young to learn that and to understand that kind of conversation that might be resolved. Who is this child? What is that? What will they need? What will they need into the future? And what can we do to begin to strengthen the child's ability in all sorts of ways? And part of that is to entertain a vision for the future as well, is to kind of seek a visionary outlook, perhaps, of going to regular school, of being able to walk independently and to talk and communicate, to read, to have a sense of a vision of what is possible. And therefore, in planning the non-programmatic relationship is to bring those things about. And that's a huge advantage. And that so part of the problem is that we may enter non-programmatic arrangements, you know, applications for funding, meeting with a planner, you know, having the plan, looking at the menu, you know, putting in the submissions, and all of that happens very quickly, perhaps, without necessarily a thorough understanding of where in the heck are we going with this? And part of the reason for that, I wonder, is that in a sense, people feel they need a service, and the way to get a service is to go here and basically accept anything on offer, perhaps even everything on offer, because the idea, their vision might be then that this child needs to be surrounded by 24/7 service. And that's not a particularly powerful vision, and we'll come back to that kind of issue. The problem too, in starting too early down this track, is that there's a tendency for the non-programmatic domain to want to dominate and preoccupy preoccupy the conversation. And again, you can see that in the forums. There's not often a lot of discussion about what people need and what kind of responses would truly meet people's needs. It's about how to wrangle with this. How do I get this? They've done a review and they've cut me out of this. You know, those kind of conversations. I heard someone was able to get this and I want that too. How do you get that? You know, those kind of conversations. And so it tends to dominate. And that means too that the non-programmatic issues end up becoming the vision for a person of being surrounded by formal service. It's less about, well, what would the good things of life look like for this person? And how can we use the non-programmatic, the formal side of the service system, if that's what we need, to bring that about? So in other words, it tends to shrink the vision a bit. We end up with a service system vision, because a person can end up with a service system life, and something we'll come back to. So here's the supplanting of the vision, and it becomes the vision when it's really not a vision at all. A vision is something that tells us the way to go. It projects that direction. It shows us how we're making progress. It defines the progress. But here, the progress is to get a service. And once we get the service, then it's like, how do we keep the service? How do we keep the service going? And it's like the means becomes the end, getting and keeping a service. And for some people, it's about expanding the service or keeping what I've got. And of course, not all service systems want that to happen. They will question it, as this one does, and that's a proper thing to do. But the assumption is once I've got it, I then have to keep it. Itself becomes a vision of the future. And it's more about the mechanism of providing a service than the kind of needs that that service is supposed to meet over here. It becomes an end in itself of having that kind of service. Now, I just got a new whiteboard. I get to use it. How's that? $240 at Officeworks, pretty good value. Anyway, what's some of the effects of what can be a distorted emphasis on the non-programmatic domain over the programmatic issues? And so looking at that now is that the needs get equated with what the system is willing to provide. So you see then a shrinkage of the view of what it is this person needs already in some of the menus that are available. But menus have always been there, you know, this far and no further kind of idea that service systems tend to bring. And therefore we start to imagine that a person's needs are the same as what is provided. And you hear this in the language, you know, she needs a group home. Well, a group home isn't a human need. What is the need that the group home was supposed to meet? Kind of idea. And so it's a sense of containing and narrowing our view of the person and their needs because of the narrowed perspective that the non-programmatic system might bring. Another one is therefore limits the different ways that needs might be responded to. We start to think that only paid arrangements meet needs, and that for every need that we might identify, you better get a paid situation in place for it. Unpaid arrangements couldn't do this. And it means more and more then that people are surrounded by workers who are there, and the more workers we have. And again, it confines people away from the ordinary ways, these different and ordinary ways that people's needs can get met, and that they haven't been exhausted, or that we might look at ways they get strengthened. You know, things that we might do to strengthen a family's capacity to meet the needs of a child. And you know, and the inclusion of informal relationships, of friends, of family, members of the community. And of course, the more service a person tends to get, the more formalized their life becomes. And a sense this formality, it means it's official, it's paid, and therefore there are requirements, there are reporting requirements. You know, if you visit your grandmother in a nursing home, you don't have to write a report about that. But if you're a worker or even a parent, You probably do. There has to be some kind of accountability. And the accountability these days has become heavier and heavier than in the days when I started. There's almost no accountability, but no reporting. And now the accountability can become so onerous is that it introduces the potential that people have to cheat some way to get around it because it's just too hard. It's mountainous, layer upon layer, with the assumption is that this makes everything more efficient, which it doesn't. It's actually, it distracts everyone from the business at hand in meeting someone's needs. As now we're meeting the needs of an office to report about all the things that we've done. And it might take longer than the actual doing. The reporting supersedes the doing. We have to write about it for longer than we got to do it. If any of you working around education, you might know that the teachers at the moment are only lasting on average 5 years because it's so onerous, the reporting requirements for a regular classroom teacher, they're out of there. You know, their weekends are taken up doing reporting and doing preparation. And it's so, and it doesn't add to the quality of what it is they're doing. But the assumption is that it does, that it should, and it does. There's several books on this topic. Here's one. This was part of the Massey lectures in Canada, the CBC Massey lectures. This is called The Cult of Efficiency. And this woman, Janice Gross-Stein, speaks to, you know, the assumptions that all of this is going to make things better, but it doesn't. And then this fellow, Philip Howard, he too writes about this, a rule of nobody, meaning that everything is so set in place by policies and procedures, you're never allowed to make a decision anyway. And we see many workers affected by these constraints that just make you comply to the rules. So it drives out creativity, it drives out innovation, and everyone is dead scared to make a decision because they think they'll get into trouble about it. So that's another whole workshop, but it's part of what we mean here by formal paid arrangements, and that is very different from the ways we might go about meeting people's needs in an informal way. And so this formalization actually enters people's lives, and the bureaucratization that it involves. And that's why there's this scope for corruption, because it gets so heavy. It's like, how do I get out? I got to cheat somehow, and in order to handle this kind of stuff. And that's a terrible thing. You'd hope that you could be just honest because the system is fair about what it's asking you to do. So the other thing too, of course, is that what makes for a very good programmatic response to someone's needs is that the things we do here are based on the needs of the individual. But systems find individual response, as we saw with the robo thing of Centrelink recently, tends towards standardization, not customization. Yet it's a customized service that makes the difference for people. And that truly is the gold standard, you might say, is that what is being provided here, both its necessity, its relevance, but also that it's done in certain ways that are specific to that individual. And of course, that's where the system comes in. It says it has to be done a certain way. And that's very common. Now, of course, there may be things that a parent and any manager can do to massage the system to get it to bend for an individual. And you might even win occasionally in getting some concessions around the needs of a person for something to be done a certain way. But you then have to fight to keep that. It's quite possible that the next review that comes along, they suggest that you're not getting that anymore because it's not fair, because equity and access says everybody should get the same. That's right, get standardized. It's like a McDonald's version of service rather than a fancy restaurant that's going to do things just right for you. And so the next one then is paid service has intrinsic limitations. We might have, I'll talk to Rhiannon and Rosita about this, an additional talk about this very thing, is that there are just some things that paid workers can't provide by the very nature of paid work. the limitations that come with paid work that's inbuilt. It's not their fault, it's not that they're bad people. Even really good people, the best of workers, will face these same limitations. For instance, there'll be certain things they must do that may not actually even be needed by the person, and things that they should be doing for the person they're not allowed to. So those kind of limitations is built into the role. And so the more we go down the non-programmatic route, and especially if we do that very early, and the more we're reliant on this perspective in seeing the person, the more these things are going to hound us and affect what the person ultimately receives. We also know that the more formal and paid arrangements there are in a person's life, there's a tendency for that to drive out the other people in a person's life who are there without payment. It's like the professionals have turned up, and it looks like I might need to have a police check now to talk to this person. It's like informal relationships feel that they may be unwanted here and unneeded, or that they're unqualified. They're not like these paid people, and that this person may be so unique and different from everybody else that everyone in their life has to be paid to be there, kind of assumptions. And so you find this driving out kind of effect. And that's interesting, given that one of the major needs that people end up have is for freely given relationships. But the nature of the service system that they're a part of actually exacerbates this need and makes it worse. And it's like, how do we deal with that? And so having to be a bit careful about this. So it sometimes pains me when I see on the forums people who are just so seeking of these paid arrangements as though they are a form of salvation. And I think, oh, do they know what they're in for? Can they see where this will take them? And that's why the distinction between programmatic and non-programmatic issues is also very helpful for us to get a sense of proportionality about those things. And of course, the vision for life, as I mentioned, now becomes filled with assessors and support workers and reviews and their funding rounds and trips to therapists and blood tests and so on. And instead of the typical life, especially if a vision hadn't been well formed here, instead of a typical life, you end up with a service life, and it means responding to appointments and so on. And the interesting aspect of a service life is that the arrangements are organized in advance, usually. It's freely given relationships and informal relationships that usually are very good at spontaneous responses to people's needs. But the service system isn't too good at this. It doesn't tend to want to act in the moment because, well, I might be making a decision and I better not get into trouble for doing that. And therefore everything has to be set up in advance. There might be multiple meetings and more assessment needed. You might have to go to court to win it, and some of this stuff gets dragged out for years. And as opposed to a person's needs that are met in the moment, which is what freely given relationships are all about and able to do very well. So once a person's life gets surrounded by paid arrangements, spontaneous needs, get much harder to respond to. And it's like, if that's not built into that plan in advance, we can't do it. We're not allowed because it's not part of the plan that had to be approved first of all. And there's often an assumption when a life becomes surrounded by non-programmatic issues is that the person will need more service, not less. And of course, as the informal relationships begin to fall apart or disappear, then the life more and more becomes defined by the service. That is, they get a service life and they get service roles. And if you had ideas that the person's life might have valued roles in it, but they're, should know how to spell roles, valued roles in it, and yet the person's surrounded by service, you're going to then have a tension between those two things. It's not impossible to deliver, but a service life is harder to bring about because the major role here is one of client, one as a recipient, and it defines then the worker as a support worker in regard to a recipient, and that's about it. Whereas if we're clear about here's our vision, then we might also ask support workers to work in roles that are complementary to the valued roles the person is acquiring here. We have much more to say about that in the 2-day SRV workshop, and I suspect some of you have been to that. Now, we've got a potential here for a Trojan horse. A Trojan horse is, oh, the horse, look at it, looks fantastic, let's bring it in. And then, of course, the army runs out and invades you. And there is potential for services to be like this. One of our American colleagues wrote an article about this, and we send you the link in the follow-up to this session, and you can see the article about clienthood and services as a Trojan horse. It's an interesting analogy that you just might get more than you bargained for. So what to do about this in our closing minutes so we can have some time for some questions. First one's very simple and straightforward. Try and deal with programmatic questions. Who is this person? What is it they need? What is it they need more than other things? Therefore, how would we respond in normative ways before we start ringing and bringing in the Trojan horse, the funding and so on, because we may discover that there are many ordinary ways that we can meet these needs to begin with anyway. And now managers though, and that might include some self-directing families, do have to get good at both areas. And particularly if a person is receiving funding, then and there are support staff, then you better know how this works. And there are some very good agencies online that are giving great training on the current system with the NDIS. And of course, that system will continue to change. As soon as you think you know it, well, just don't hold your breath because it'll change quite quickly. There's a group called DCS. I have no association with them, but I do get some of their emails, and they run some great workshops largely in the non-programmatic domain, though they may not look at it that way. Certainly from SRV's perspective, that this is largely about handling the system. But that's what managers need to be able to do. If you're going to implement change and fulfill these kind of visions here, then you need to get good at both. And also 3 questions that are quite handy in the programmatic area is to do, well, what is their life like now? What could their life look like if their needs were met? So a picture of the person's life, not the picture of their service. What would their life look like? And the third question is, well, what can we do now that's a step in that direction of that future while we're waiting for these resources? Get started with that. So they're the 3 questions. Another one, of course, is to be clearer then about the vision, and the vision you keep coming back to, and sometimes you need a catalyst that sometimes occurs to kind of revitalize your vision and take you to the next step. So visions don't last forever. Sometimes you reach your vision, or you realize that once you get started in a person's life, you weren't optimistic enough in your vision. The person's actually been able to go much further than you imagined at the time of your initial conversation. And remember too, that non-programmatic issues tend to impose itself on the programmatic area. So you're wanting to be a shield of that. You're trying to stop the non-programmatic area invading a person's life. So you want to keep the bureaucracy out of their life, out of the family's life in some way. Of course, with self-governance, we've invited the family to become like a service, and that too may potentially make the family into a little service of sorts. And so they're having to handle that imposition, that formalization and bureaucratization that's now entered the family. Brings many advantages, of course. You can recruit the staff you really want, and you can get them to do things that meet these kind of requirements, but it's also onerous, and not everyone can handle that. And then, of course, when you're clear about the needs, you can be clear about how they're met. What is it that is actually required, which means that we help the support workers' role to become clear as well. They're not just there to some general notion of support. They're there to create some roles which defines the roles they are in, what competencies are needed, what kind of images are needed. And so if paid people are there, it means that they too have to have a well-defined role, and that both parties benefit from this. the recipient party benefits because they're heading in a certain direction that fulfills their vision. But the worker also benefits because now they have a well-defined role that is about helping someone get the good things of life. And that's just a fabulous job. It's not vague and ambiguous where they can't, as it were, define whether they're successful or not. That means then that they're actually looking at the definitions of success in terms of what happens in this person's life. The non-programmatic definitions of success are that you've been successful in your contract. Contract acceptance, which might mean you've handed in on your paperwork in. That becomes the definition of success. You can see how distorted this can become by way of helping people's needs to be met or not. So let me stop there, and perhaps we might have the second poll now can go up. And if my microphone can stay on, I'll also talk about some of the additional events, and then we'll take some questions. So there's your poll. You can answer that. As Rhiannon said, we have an SRV event that's a 2-day event on the 16th and 17th of February, all being well with open borders. I live in Melbourne and we would have to come to Sydney. So hopefully by February we can do that, or we can still do that. The next day, a 1-day event on the impact of intellectual impairment. And this workshop is about how to put people at best advantage. It's a very popular event, and the material we teach in that event is difficult to get anywhere else. We haven't seen it pop up. In the following week, we're going to have an SRV, 2-day SRV event in Canberra, sponsored by Jan Kruger and Imagine More. And that's on the 22nd and 23rd of February. And Belonging Matters in Melbourne. If you come from Melbourne, we're having a 2-day SRV event on the 9th and 10th of March. Just while we're still going, just to let you know, I have a series of workshops online, 22 hours of workshops against 10 programs, including the intellectual disability event and a 1-day workshop on preventing abuse, but a lot of other SRV related material. You can find that at johnarmstrong.media. It's a license you purchase, and many families are purchasing this because they can easily train their staff in programmatic issues. And that's what these are all about. What are the programmatic issues? What does it take to meet someone's needs in a way that's really effective? Some of you may have seen, but we've also now got a new book that's come out, and it's about aging. And through the lens of SRV. Of course, as you know, many elderly people are also devalued. We've seen a lot of that. COVID has certainly brought that to the fore, and we've seen the death rates as it affects. Now, that's available from the Community Resource Unit, CRU in Queensland, or from Belonging Matters in Melbourne. The book is the same price, about $37, and that's great. It's a great read. There are 3 chapters by Wolfensberger that have never been published in this particular book as well. So if you're supporting people who are getting older, or you're getting older yourself, you may need to read this one. And so that's out and available now. Next time, we're going to look at the tensions between formal service when it's conducted in an informal environment, such as the home. And so we're going to look at what are the things that we might do to dampen the tension, given that more and more these days, people are being supported singularly and within the context of home or their surrounding community. And yet, as we've seen, service brings formality. How do we soften the impact of that when supporting someone to have their own home and experience the fullness of that? So thank you, everyone. And thanks to Rhiannon and Rosita and Foundations Forum for sponsoring today's event on a topic that we haven't often had a chance to look at. So I'll hand it back to you and we'll see if there are any questions.
All right. Well, what we might do, John, we haven't had any questions come through from the Q&A, but we have, if you would like to ask a question, you can unmute yourself. We've allowed that to happen. So please, if you would like to ask John a question or have something to share, we invite you to come forward now. Great opportunity.
They're speechless, Rhiannon.
I know.
They might think, what was that all about?
And look, thank you for your patience as well. Like, this is our first time using this sort of format and with John. So hopefully it has worked and has been of quality. But yeah, we're looking forward to seeing you at the next ones. But hopefully, was there anyone that, oh, here we go. Here's a question. Oh, not sure how to unmute. You should be able to just right click on yourself. Oh, Rosita, you can't unmute, or host has disabled attendee chat. So you might have to unmute all the attendees. Okay, so we've had one question from Bernadette, and Bernadette has asked, how can we convince service providers of the need to focus on needs? Such a great question.
It is a great question, because their consciousness about that would have to be raised immediately. And unfortunately, you do see many agencies who've been audited and had wonderful audit results, and yet end up not being very good. We've seen this in the aged care area as well, audits, but people are discovered to be abused, like the worst kind of treatment in a context where auditors have been through. And that's because it's an interesting issue, is that most of the audits of the system, by the system, are focusing on non-programmatic measures, which are reasonable. They're reasonable, but of course, in a service arrangement, you actually want to measure the quality of what it is you're doing, and can you define that? And so most audits are over here, which also then directs most agencies to have to improve their ability to meet these requirements, not this one. Isn't that interesting? And so it may be that they're completely unaware that the impact of their service on people is atrocious, even though their non-programmatic compliance to the requirements of the service system appear outstanding. And we've had many examples. I won't name agencies that you will have heard of in even the last 6 or 12 months, where they had met all of these requirements, and the system believes them to be an exemplary service, but what they're delivering programmatically is appalling. So that's a difficult area, isn't it? How do you bring that to the attention of leaders? And most of the SRV training we do is actually, in one sense, directed to leadership, because things don't change unless leadership are affected by that. And so quite often, how can you help leaders to take notice of these distinctions, given that some of them have backgrounds that are strongly identified with the non-programmatic domain? You know, they've been brought in as a finance director from BHP, and now they're running a human service, and their total focus is down this area of having policies and procedures, you know, everywhere, and the filing cabinets full of policies, as though if we do that, then we're a good service. And it's a complete illusion, isn't it? And so how do you, and sometimes it takes a scandal to alert people to this, but our system simply shuts those places down, and it just makes everyone else more scared. You might realize too that in the aged care system, this is the second quality group that they had. The previous one all got sacked. The second one is doing exactly the same things that the first one did, is that they're measuring non-programmatic compliance, and it's the wrong measure. When you're in a human service, is that you've actually got to see what is the outcome in people's lives, not in administration. And something that in some ways seems so clear, but very difficult to get across in any way that leaders of agencies or leaders of the service system will take notice of. As I mentioned, in general education now, that the requirements of the bureaucracy, the education department bureaucracy now, are so overwhelming, and the message from teachers is loud and clear about what should happen, but no one has taken any notice. And so once people invest at this side, it's hard for them to switch across suddenly, because that's quite a revelation and it's a revelation that many leaders won't go to, because they'd have to then feel guilty about their past, and they won't do that. So they stick with it and they hammer it away. So it's not a very satisfactory answer. It just says it's a real problem. But it is through individual leaders who recognize the difference and realize the priority must be given to really meeting people's needs and not meeting the needs of the service system.
Thanks, John. And Catherine, and now I think everyone has the ability to be able to unmute if you would like to discuss. We don't have a huge amount. So Catherine has got, Hogan made a comment about the opportunity to self-manage NDIS funds gives us, the family members, much more capacity to focus on the programmatic side and remove most of the majority of the non-programmatic issues.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, that's excellent. And it's good if you know that, though. Otherwise, you might embrace it almost as a service manager, reveling in the bureaucracy. I've met some people who manage their own funds. And much like the old role we used to people would say, I'm a self-advocate, like I now have a valued role, they're now saying I'm a self-manager. And rather than, again, the service being a means to an end, it's become the end for them. And it's a little sad. It wasn't meant just to give you that role. It was meant to be the springboard to a vast array of other roles, rather than an end in itself. Be that as it may, there's probably a lot more to being a service manager in those contexts than there are a self-advocate, and which is a little bit vague and not very clear.
And we've got a question from Kim Roots. She's asked, can you share an example of how paid supports can help to facilitate freely given relationships?
Oh, that's another whole workshop, Kim. But it's an interesting one because in a way it's setting up an arrangement that the worker then has to, as it were, subtly withdraw from. And it may be introducing people into arrangements, expressing the ability of the person to do whatever that arrangement demands, and introducing the person to others in a way that allows then other parties to interact with the person. Whereas we have many examples, for instance, of workers who prohibit interaction because, you know, where someone on the street might say, hey, I know you, what's your name again? And the worker then intervenes and said, that's confidential. You know, or you don't have a police check for that question or something silly like that. So these are workers who are very adept at understanding that freely given relationships is where the action really is, and it permits the participation of people into those roles. So it's also the cutting edge work, you might say. What is it a worker might do to facilitate this person's presence within their community? And you don't see a lot of it done well. You see people who are visitors to the community, they're observers of the community, but they're rarely participating with the community. And the subtle nature of that work, where a worker might be a co-participant, so they go to the gym together, but in a sense they're subtly moving this person to the forefront of the interaction and introducing them to the other gym members, for instance, in such a way as that those other parties then feel confident to interact with them directly. If they look like a support worker, though, that sends a big signal. This is a client and you better stay away from them because only I know how to deal with them. So you have to come across in a way that isn't confirming of a support worker role. You have to not present the person as a client, but in the role that they're truly obtaining. So they have to look like and be in the role, let's say a gym member, and the worker has to be in a role that doesn't look like a support worker. Then people are willing and game enough to approach and interact. And particularly if they see you there regularly and that you're more in a co-participant role, perhaps or a coach or mentor or even gym instructor, but in a way that facilitates entry of others, not keeps them at bay. So that's a kind of short answer, but it's lovely work and lovely to see when people do this stuff really well. But unfortunately, it's a bit rare. I've seen workers walk 3 meters from people, so with the idea that they wouldn't then impose their values on this person. Well, that's so ridiculous. You think, like, where do you start? You know, and Anyway.
Okay, we've got a few more minutes. If anyone had no more questions to the chat, if anyone else had something to ask before we end today. Okay. Don't think we've got any more. So I think we might finish up there. We hope that we'll see you next week, next Tuesday, for the second topic that John will be presenting. And as oh, I think we've just had one more question come through. Oh, thank you. Oh, someone just said thank you. So
thanks, everyone.
There you go. But thanks so much for joining us. And we'll be sending you out a copy of the recording when it becomes available. And please do share other events and webinars with your colleagues and other networks. So thanks again. And thanks, John, to you too.
We can mute.